Hi, welcome to this video lecture for English 340, Survey of English Literature 1. This is Dr. Newman. Today I'm going to be introducing you to the first part of our program of study in this course, which is the literature of the Old English period, also called the Anglo-Saxon period. Now, the English language that we speak is a hybrid of a Germanic language, that is a language related to Danish or German or Swedish. Most of the most commonly used words in our language, sun, moon, sister, father, cow, dirt, come from this old Germanic language that was brought here by invaders in the first millennium. But we have many other languages that were brought here by the French when they invaded, particularly the Normans in 1066. Words such as government, bureaucracy, soldier, words that belonged to the ruling class of the Middle Ages during the Middle English period, which we'll be getting to in some weeks. But for now, we're going to talk about the Old English period. And this picture here is just meant to illustrate the vast extent of time we're covering in this class. This picture here is from the late 17th and early 18th century when people wore wigs. I guess this is where the expression "he's a bigwig" comes from. Fun fact, one of the theories for why wigs became so fashionable during the 16 and 1700s was because of the epidemic of syphilis, which was treated with mercury, and mercury made people lose their hair. So you have all these rich aristocrats who start wearing wigs. The king of France is wearing a wig, so I guess we'll all wear wigs too. No wigs up here. These are some Anglo-Saxons. There's a smith throwing iron onto the fire. Next, I guess, an apprentice there with a bellows, and they're all like, "Yo, check that out." So just to show you the vast differences in material culture, prosperity, civilization over the course of time that we're studying. But let's go back to 500 AD, or CE if you prefer. This here is the island of Great Britain. This section here is Wales, today Wales. This section up here is Scotland. And England, really, is just this portion right here. Now, before the Anglo-Saxons came, this area was inhabited by people that are usually called Romano-Celts or Celtic Romans. They were of Celtic stock, of background. They had been Celts before the British Empire, related to the present-day Welsh and Irish and Scots people. But they were thoroughly Romanized. They lived in Roman-type towns and had amphitheaters and baths. The town of Bath in England, where the wife of Bath, Chaucer's wife of Bath, comes from, is from a town that was famous for having these Roman baths. Now, as the Roman Empire in the first few hundred years of the first millennium slowly collapsed like a flan in a cupboard, you get these Germanic people on the move everywhere. There's a tribe that moves into Gaul called the Franks, and that's why it's called France. There's a group of Germanic people called Lombards who move into northern Italy. There's a group called the Visigoths who move into what is now Spain. And there are several groups of Germanic peoples who move onto the island of Great Britain. The Angles, the Jutes, the Saxons, the Irish are Celtic. They're coming from the other way. They're also invading this weak island at this point. In fact, St. Patrick was originally Welsh and was kidnapped by Irish raiders and brought to Ireland. And then he was freed and went back. But anyway, that's another story. The Angles, Jutes, and Saxons spoke a similar language, and we'll talk a little bit about that language, but it was a Germanic language, and they sort of took over this island. It took a while. It didn't happen. It wasn't like they just came in right away and said, "Hey, this island's ours now." They came in and they started settling, and there were some battles, and there's a lot of controversy over how much they completely extirpated, that is, uprooted and drove out the Celtic inhabitants, and how much they sort of blended with them, and because of the fact that they were conquerors and the fact that they had a way of life that was more suited to local self-reliant communities than the Roman ways had been, their language gets adapted by the Celtic people who remain in England and don't go west to Wales or Cornwall or north to Scotland to retain their Celtic or Celto-Roman language and customs. So obviously the Angles and the Saxons were two different tribes, and they both merged to it gets merged together to refer to as the Angles and Saxons. The Jutes, who knows who knows what happened to the Jutes? Fast forward a couple hundred years. It's now 700 AD, and we have this area is in white here is England. That is the land of the Angles. The reason that the word Angle and Anglish wins out over Saxon is because there were already Saxons in the continent. In what is today Germany, there are three different places called Saxony. So they were like, we got enough Saxons and Saxonies already. Anyway, but the word Saxon still survives in such place names in England as Wessex, that is, the West Saxon Kingdom, Sussex, the South Saxon Kingdom, Essex, the East Saxon Kingdom, and so forth. If you've ever watched on Netflix The Last Kingdom, it talks about the Danish invasions of Anglo-Saxon England, and the Last Kingdom was Wessex, where King Alfred resisted the Danish invaders and some claim saved English cultural identity and the English language. And he was also a very scholarly man himself and a patron of the arts and scholarship, and so is the only British monarch called the Great, that is Alfred the Great. And so here are the main parts of Anglo-Saxon England. They spoke different dialects of the language that we refer to as Old English. In 880 CE, the Vikings invaded, or the Danes. Viking was something they did. That was raiding up rivers in boats. And they took over this large part of England, which came to be known as the Danelaw. That is, that was under Danish rule. And there are still features of English, as we speak it, that contain residue of the Danish invasion. They didn't speak Old English, they spoke Old Norse. And the Old Norse language gave to ours words like they, them, and their, and also words like skirt and skill, various other words too. Window's a good one. It actually literally means the eye of the wind. So this is the English language is already a hybrid from the very beginning, even before the Norman conquest. So who were the Anglo-Saxons? Well, they were pagans, so to speak. The word pagan comes from a Roman word, paganus, which means essentially hick. During the late Roman Empire, Christianity was a city religion. It was an urban religion. It spread along trade routes. And the old gods continued to be worshipped out in the sticks, essentially. So those who still worship Jupiter and all those other Rick Riordan gods, they were considered to be sort of backwards, and so that's where the word paganus, pagan, comes from. And so the Anglo-Saxon invaders came to an island of Britain that was already Christianized. It was Roman Christian. There were monasteries there. There were bishops and so on and so forth. When the Anglo-Saxons came, they drove out a lot of the sort of Christian civilization, and it went again to Wales, which remained Christian. The story of Arthur is, the various stories of Arthur as they survive, are the stories of a Romano-Celtic Christian fighting off Germanic pagan invaders. So they worshipped gods that were basically like Thor and Odin and Freya, the Germanic pantheon as it's known. But it didn't take that long before they were Christianized. But they had older customs for a long time, such as burying their kings in mounds with lots of treasure, and sometimes in some of the older mounds with slaves and wives. Cute, hey? So this is an example of the sophisticated metalwork of the Anglo-Saxon. This is the so-called Sutton Hoo burial mask. This is part of a great treasure trove that was found in the early 20th century of Anglo-Saxon treasure. And, some of it, a lot of it was of Anglo-Saxon make, but you also find in there coins and other items from the Byzantine and from the Islamic world. At this time, in the 700, 800 period, the richest and most powerful civilization in the world was that of the Muslim Arabs, centered around the city of Baghdad, which was a grand and brilliant city full of scholars. England, at this point, is a remote, barely populated backwater. Now, the Anglo-Saxons were Christianized between 700 and between 600 and 800, not all at once, but through the work of missionaries, both coming out of both Ireland and out of Rome and Gaul. And they set up a brilliant monastic culture. This is an example of the beautiful book arts that they made, the Lindisfarne Gospel, from the late 7th and early 8th century. Lindisfarne was a monastery on the east coast of England, and monasteries were the centers of culture and of scholarship and of the transmission of the inheritance both of the Judeo-Christian spiritual traditions and also Roman learning, Latin learning that had survived from classical antiquity. At this point, a lot of Greek learning has been forgotten in the West. But this book here is the Gospel of Matthew. You can see there, it says there's an L, there's an I, there's a B, an E, and an R. So that says Liber. And then it says there's a Generationie. So this is the Liber Generationem Matteo. This is the book of the generations. This is the Gospel of Matthew. And books were great treasures in the Middle Ages. Great treasures. They were very expensive to make because that's not paper. That's parchment. And parchment is the skin of an animal, usually a sheep, that's been scraped clean and specially treated. So when you look at a big book like this, you're looking at a flock of sheep. That's a lot of wealth to commit to something that isn't going to be immediately useful for sort of food or survival or anything like that. Here's a detail of that image again, and we can see here's the text in Latin, and those little marginal notes there are in English. So this is some of the earliest English that we have is actually marginalia in Latin texts, little translations, little notes. This is some of the first written English that we find. Now, the manuscript culture survives even into the age of print. This is one of the earliest Bibles in the English language, and you can see how when we switch to print culture with movable type, the idea of the book remains the same, and so we still have these storiated initials, and we still have illustrations in the same way in the old kind of writing. Now, as we'll see, the culture of Anglo-Saxon of England was a culture that really esteemed military heroism, bravery, courage, the warrior cult. It celebrated, primitive Germanic culture celebrated great warriors. The way their society was organized was that those who were the most powerful fighters basically had the most prestige in their tribe. And the king, the word king is related to kinning, which means the son of the family, the son of the clan. And the king is not necessarily hereditary, but is the greatest warrior of his generation. And a good king, as we'll see when we read Beowulf, is somebody who gives out lots of treasure to his main dudes. And so that culture, even when they become Christianized and baptized, that culture doesn't really go away right away. What we see here is a torque, that is an armband, a piece of jewelry made out of gold, and in it are the Latin words surge domini, it's abbreviated, dissipentur inimici tui et fugiant qui oderunt, and on the other side, tea facie tua, rise up, Lord, may your enemies be scattered, and those who hate you be driven from your face. Now, one can well imagine a bunch of Anglo-Saxon warrior dudes, listening to the monk read to them and teach them about the God of the Christians, and he reads this bit from the Psalms, and they're like, yeah, that's an attitude I can get behind. I like that. I'm going to put that on my torque here and give it to my dude. So this is an example of what we're going to talk about, which is syncretism. And syncretism is a combination of two religious or spiritual or cultural traditions. What we see in a lot of early Old English culture is the combination of pagan Germanic warrior values and Christian culture, Christian teaching. And as we'll see when we get to Beowulf, those things don't always fit super well together. All right, this is part 1 of this video, and I'm going to post part 2 separately, so hang in there.